And speaking of caring about others, tomorrow a high-level group will convene virtually, naturally, to talk about creating an international social fund to assist the people of lower income countries come out of the year-long pandemic economic shutdown. Now, folks in the audience who lap up every one of our episodes with gusto will know that I spent a lot of time on the crisis facing workers around the world who, before the pandemic even hit, faced some pretty dire economic realities. Just recently, you may remember, I had a follow-up segment about a move to create $2 trillion of so-called special drawing rights at the International Monetary Fund, money that would be effectively grants to low-income countries at no cost to U.S. taxpayers and without adding more debt burden to the borrowing countries. A no-brainer, right? So what's the idea now for a social fund? Let's get the answer from our good friend Cathy Feingold, director of the AFL-CIO's International Affairs Department and deputy president of the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents 200 million unionized workers all across the globe. Now, this panel, Cathy, that you are part of and organizing, that's in conjunction with the spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, is about something that you're trying to put together, which is establishing a global social protection fund. And I want to talk about some of the specifics about that. But one of the things that really caught my eye, and it's not about low-income countries, it's actually about the United States. In the summary for this panel, and I'm going to just read from it, you say, there is limited capacity for low-income countries to respond to the social and economic consequences of COVID-19 because of underdeveloped social protection systems and limited revenue. And the first thing that came to my mind is, well, the U.S. may have a lot of revenue, but my God, we have such an underdeveloped social protection system here that really everybody saw during the pandemic, with people not having sick leave, bad safety and health situation in many of the frontline workers. I don't want to talk about the United States too much in our conversation, but that struck me.
Oh, of course. And I just want for everyone to know, social protection is a term that's used more commonly in other countries. We often say social security nets in our country, and it's really the same thing. It's really creating a floor that protects working people. And I think you're right. And so I'd like to clarify, what we're talking about is the creation of a global social protection fund for some of the poorest countries. But what we're also doing is building a coalition in the US, which is really to increase funding around global social protection for development assistance, but also highlight the failures of our own system and systems around the world that have left 60% of working people do not have social protection programs. 60%.
That's not surprising, unfortunately. It's sad and just amoral. And just to make one more point about the United States, optimistically, I have thought in this whole year that we've been immersed in this pandemic that there is this opening now to talk to a lot more people, both from the standpoint of the labor movement and other folks, talk to a lot of people about the fact that we have this awful system in the country where you had people who couldn't go home and get well because there was no paid sick leave. You know the whole list. So I wonder if you're optimistic about the ability to have that conversation as well.
I think so. I think also some of the conversation people are currently having around the equity issues around the vaccines, we should also be talking about social protection. If you do not have paid leave, it's very difficult to go far away to a mass vaccination site. And so without social protection programs, you do not have the needed tools to really respond, not only to this current crisis, but another crisis I know you're focused on, which is the climate crisis. You cannot transition workers out of industries with heavy fossil fuel if there's no social protection systems that will give them income support, pension bridges, healthcare in the need to transition workers. So social protection must be part of the way we rebuild and transform the global economy.
That's a brilliant point, especially in connecting it as you just did to climate change. Okay, so how would this Global Social Protection Fund work? How would it be funded, and how would the money be distributed? Have people thought this through already, the mechanics of it?
Absolutely. So remember, many of the countries, the poorest countries in the world, many countries where our US brands, multinational companies, source and produce products have no social protection systems. And that has had a real impact on supply chains. So what we've been looking at is the International Labor Organization estimates that around $78 billion annually would be needed to fund a social protection floor for the world's poorest, lowest income countries. Now, that sounds like a big number, but if you think about it, it would impact about 28 countries. And 78 billion to rebuild with resilience means you're then not spending in emergency money, like the current moment we're in, to patch up the needs of people during a crisis so that you're building resilience.
When you said that number, I actually thought it was so low. When you said 78 billion, I thought we're talking about tens of millions of people. I would have thought that it should be a factor of 5 or 10-fold more. So actually, that seems like a very small number.
Yeah, and I mean, so what we're doing, this is being advocated in what's called the Group of 20, which is some of the 20 largest industrialized countries. It's a forum where leaders go to sort of coordinate responses, especially now to the pandemic. We're asking that the international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank help step up and figure out how we get financing for these critical issues. We are also really excited. I'll be on this panel with Olivier de Schutter, who's the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And he's helping to kind of build out the framework for this global fund because he knows you can't address poverty without addressing social protection.
So would this fund be built by the G20, by, if I can use the term, the rich countries? And then if you're a low income country, you would come to this fund and say, we need X money. I'm being very, superficial about it.
So it's the political will that we need to first have really leaders. And we have a lot of countries now agreeing to lead. And the Biden administration, we think, is going to be able to lead on this important issue. The actual financing and the International Trade Union Confederation, we're going to release a report at this webinar next week around how you finance it. It's not just from the countries itself. Some of it could come from there, but it's also these international financial multilateral banks that we're asking for them to refocus some of their funding to address these needs.
Now, you mentioned that this meeting is taking place in conjunction with the spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. And I've done a couple of segments on the program about this attempt to create the special drawing rights, which you are quite familiar with. And I'm wondering how that would dovetail with this fund, because at least the effort to create the special drawing rights, to remind my audience, this would be money essentially that would be created by the IMF so that poor countries could come and essentially have an account, a line item, where they could draw on that money in order to buy, let's say, vaccines or support their people, get people back to work. I wonder how those things parallel or dovetail.
Absolutely. So this week we had a meeting with Secretary Yellen. I joined a meeting with faith leaders and Jubilee USA, and this was on the agenda. So you need two major things in addition to the Global Social Protection Fund. You need debt relief. Countries should not be servicing their debt when they should be investing in vaccines and healthcare and safe workplaces right now. The second is something called a special drawing right, which is an international monetary fund. And just so people understand, this actually doesn't cost us anything.
Zero.
It's a
That's
really
right.
easy thing that Secretary Yellen can do. And so she has said publicly right now that at least we can get about $500 billion made available through this system called the special drawing rights. It gets very in the weeds, but the most important thing is it frees up money, gives country the space they need to spend on the key social protection programs that are needed during this crisis.
And just to underscore, because this topic has fascinated me for many weeks, and I've had Mark Weisbrot, one of your colleagues, on the show to talk about this a couple of times. Your point is, doesn't cost the U.S. taxpayer a single dime, and as important for the low-income countries, it's essentially a grant. They're not adding to their debt burden through these special drawing rights. So that would be a huge deal for them to get this money that isn't then essentially burdening them further into the future.
Absolutely. And that's what we are really pushing for, extending debt relief. We do not need to have this model of, poor countries constantly indebted to richer countries so that they can never build out their social protection system. So I feel hopeful. I think we're at a moment. You started by asking me, can this get done? I think this is the first time I have seen business leaders understand their supply chains can't function if they don't have workers who have paid sick leave or can have income support when the consumer demand goes down, right? This is a win-win for governments, for workers, and for business. We've got to get it done.
Well, you were telepathic, actually, as we round up our conversation. Back in the special drawing rights, one of the things that was interesting to me that when this campaign started, Goldman Sachs supported it. You had all these big corporations supporting it because if you're amoral and you don't care about people and you don't care that people die, just from a business standpoint, you can't actually reopen the global economy if obviously if the vaccines aren't there, if the pandemic isn't brought under control, but more important, if people can't survive and make a decent living. Unfortunately, 2/3 of the economy here is based on consumer spending. That's true in many other parts of the world. So you really actually have to have demand, and the only way to do that is to give people money.
Absolutely. And I would just say, for people that feel perhaps they're really removed from this conversation, I would say for folks listening here in the United States or in other countries that, we invite people to join us. One way that we're grounding this back in the United States is we believe that the U.S. Agency for International Development, some of our State Department funding should get repurposed. We should create a global fund. We're going to ask, hopefully, Samantha Powers, when she gets into office as a head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, let's build out as a global social protection fund. What a great use of our taxpayer dollars is to support an initiative that really would put a needed floor under working people during a pandemic and as we rebuild.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you very much for being on the program. Thank you very much for all the work that you and the AFL-CIO have been doing on this. Good luck with the panel, and we'll keep on this story as it unfolds.
Great. Thanks so much.